So we got our start with brewer's grain. That's because I started brewing beer myself when I was at university. And I started wondering what to do with all the grains that are left behind from that process. And so we developed a new ingredient from that, a powder that's really high in protein, really high in fiber, that can be really beautifully incorporated into breads and snacks and all kinds of food products. And that's a good example of the type of work that we do. The way that our business is structured is we have two kind of divisions, as it were. One is around ingredient development, commercialization, sales, and then the other is more of a services model where we're helping more upstream with the research and the development of what we hope will become ingredients that we can then, introduce to the market.
Hi, Dan. Thanks for joining us in Scouted by GreyB. And my name is Shabaz. And before I start right away, I'd like to know, what's up, how are you doing, and basically what's going on with Upcycled Foods recently. Something that you would like to share with us, something that is not made public yet, or any exciting news, basically.
Yeah, no, that sounds great, Shabazz. Thanks for being here. I think one of the things that's going on right now that I'm most excited about is the work we're doing with our Upcycled Foods Lab, where we've had the opportunity to work with organizations across the value chain in the food system. Food manufacturers, and the example I'll share is actually with a commodities board, as well as other processors. We're trying to help them make that transition to unlocking upcycled opportunities. And, one of the projects that we're working on, we actually just put out a press release about it, is related to the California's almond industry and looking at some side streams from almond processing. And we've uncovered some really interesting nutritional and functional properties from that in partnership with the commodities board and then other stakeholders, and have been working on some really interesting prototypes that bring that ingredient into products for consumers. And this work really builds on what we started with, which I'm sure we'll get into, Shabaz, which is kind of our origins, and looking at the commercial brewing industry and the grains that have been already used to brew beer for one purpose, but have a lot of nutritional potential that we close the loop on by developing new ingredients. We're basically helping other companies and organizations now develop and implement playbooks to activate the same thing. And that's been really, really exciting and rewarding work for us recently.
That's good. I think, so what I read about Upcycled Food is, I think now hearing from you all the things that is going on, so it makes this entire thing even more exciting for me. But before I dive into my questions, I'd like, for our audience, Dan, can you give us a very quick rundown of basically what Upcycled Food is doing and what kind of impact we're planning to make?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. So my name's Dan Kurzrock. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Upcycled Foods Incorporated. We also do business under one of our brand names that some folks may be familiar with, called Regrained. And what we are doing is identifying overlooked and undervalued foods that are being left off the table today by the status quo. So as I was mentioning at the top of the conversation, we got our start with brewer's grain. That's because I started brewing beer myself when I was at university, and I started wondering what to do with all the grains that are left behind from that process. And so we developed a new ingredient from that, a powder that's really high in protein, really high in fiber, that can be really beautifully incorporated into breads and snacks and all kinds of food products. And that's a good example of the type of work that we do. The way that our business is structured is we have two kind of divisions, as it were. One is around ingredient development, commercialization, sales, and then the other is more of a services model where we're helping more upstream with the research and the development of what we hope will become ingredients that we can then, introduce to the market. And for us, this does come down to a strong purpose around mission. I mean, there's certainly commercial incentives to turn overlooked and undervalued assets into revenue and profit, but this is also a aspect of addressing the climate crisis that is commercially viable, because these are foods that have, in many cases had a lot of resources, in all cases, that have gone into producing them. So to use the example of beer, just one 6-pack of beer uses about 1 pound of grain. That pound of grain took over 330 gallons of water to produce. And so when we're able to give something a second life or a third life, creating these multiple product opportunities from what was once, one, we are effectively making our resources go further. And on a planet with finite resources and a growing population, that's really important, and really passionate about that intersection of business and impact. Business as a force for good would be another way to describe it. So that's kind of a guiding principle that motivates all of our work.
Okay, thanks for such a detailed breakdown, Dan. And I really like how the original motivation came, that when you were making your own beer, and from there you started noticing this. So currently, Upcycled Food, what I've understood, is not it's not simply about reusing grains to make flour or regrained flour. It's about basically upcycling anything, any kind of food waste that is there, and upcycled food can come up with a way to make it usable. Have I got it right?
Yeah, you're close. I mean, what I would say, my caveat on this, you've got the spirit of it for sure. In our work, what we found is that not necessarily everything that can be upcycled should be upcycled. So a lot of what we're trying to do is around collecting the dots of what might be an upcycled food opportunity, and then connecting that supply side to the demand side of where there's solutions that need to be developed. So we selectively commercialize or engage in the commercialization and market introduction of these ingredients based on actually downstream on the demand side, how they're solving problems for eventual customers. But we are tirelessly working to collect all the dots, so to speak, of where there's side streams, byproducts, food loss, food waste, that has an opportunity to be valorized into something more. But that doesn't mean that everything that can be upcycled necessarily should be from a commercial viability standpoint.
Okay. And how do you figure this out that, okay, can you give me an example of what can be
Yeah.
upcycled?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, one of the ways that I like to describe this is around two kind of main areas of solutions that can be developed through upcycled processes. So like upcycling itself is the enabling technology, so to speak, not the trend in itself. What it's about is creating either like novel ingredients that are unique, have selling propositions that are friendly for product claims, for example, and are typically going into new product development. So you called it a flour earlier, this alternative flour, this powder, is really how we talk about it, a nutritious powder that we make from the barley that's been desugared by the brewing process. We sell as a fortification into, bread products, for example, and those breads are defined by the inclusion of that product. It's not a substitute for wheat. They're making a new product that is bringing forward the attributes of the regrained supergrain. Much like when quinoa, was introduced, for those who are familiar with, with quinoa and products that are made using quinoa. I mean, that's a good example of that, where it's a new type of product. So that's kind of column A of solutions that you can develop with upcycling. Column B is also really interesting. It's just different. Instead of novel ingredients with novel application opportunities, for new product development, it's about functional substitutes, better alternatives to what exists today, using the principles of upcycling to create them. And I think what's really compelling about column B is that in a world with, the climate crisis and geopolitical conflict and supply chain disruptions, there's a lot of examples of at-risk supply chains for our food system. And with upcycling, you're finding food where it's already being produced and you're turning it into something. So if you can develop better alternatives to something that you can find, that we've worked on, for example, as an alternative to cocoa powder, that's using the principles of upcycling and using a non cacao based supply chain for that. And it's an opportunity for the customers to have stability, around something that's volatile. And it's a substitute as opposed to something that's new to be developed into something that's new. So, a lot of these examples kind of fit into either of those buckets. And so, we spoke about brewer's grain. Basically any beverage that's being produced, for example, has what you would think of as like a biomass, maybe that's left behind from that process. And we like to take a look at what's in that, but also at every step of processing. So if we take like Shabaz, do you drink coffee in the morning, for example?
Yes, a lot.
Yeah. So I mean, coffee, we love coffee globally, right? It's one of the most important crops globally. And the coffee that we drink is, of course, we think of it as a coffee bean. That bean is actually a pit, which is actually, the center of a fruit. That fruit from the coffee has some really interesting properties. It's called cascara in some parts of the world, or just coffee fruit or coffee cherry. And also the coffee plant, the tree, produces leaves, right? As any tree does. And the coffee leaf actually makes for really interesting tea products that has properties that are similar to like matcha, for example. It's got more antioxidants than matcha tea. And so when we think about coffee, instead of just thinking about the bean that we roast and then brew into a beverage, if the farmer, for example, can have an opportunity from that coffee plant to not only sell the green coffee bean, but the fruit and the leaf, that's a really good example of where there was once, one product that we were thinking of where there could be three, which produces economic benefit, it produces environmental benefit, as we talked about, but also in the case of something like like coffee, it has the potential to produce social benefit as well, because the farmers are only able to harvest coffee for a third of the year. So this gives an opportunity for sustainable production of additional, product lines, throughout the year. So that's just, I could give additional examples, whether it's the cashew nut and versus the cashew
I
apple,
understand.
which is one you may be
Yes.
familiar with. Yeah, and then there's many of these examples, and we find them to be incredibly compelling, and rewarding to investigate.
It makes sense that, I mean, of course, if we are using beans, then why not use the external fruit? External fruit might also have some benefit to them.
They do,
So
yeah.
that my question, I mean, I'm curious about this. That is upcycled food expert? I mean, what is upcycled food is as an expert in? I mean, what is the underlying technology that sets you apart? And is it something that anybody can do, or like, do you have something proprietary of your own that you've figured out?
Yeah, well, just as the questions in the order they were answered in this case. So what we're really subject matter experts in is kind of that intersection of the food science, and what's left off the table and what's possible from that, identifying and evaluating the right, let's call it conversion technology, which in some cases we've actually developed novel technology, we have some patents. And then, really importantly is the whole system of then connecting that to a commercial go-to-market. So, what problem does this solution solve for customers? What are the pathways to get to market? That whole business case around taking a great idea and seeing if it can become a great venture, something that we've become expert in. The whole concept of upcycling itself, though, anybody can do. This is not a new idea. It's actually the problem of food waste is what's new, and the need for commercial upcycling solutions is what's new. But if you think about anyone who maybe one of the easiest examples would be if you were to roast a chicken for dinner, right? And have the chicken, the chicken for dinner that night, and you might have some leftovers, and those leftovers, the meat from that can be turned into, I don't know, enchiladas, or it could be like some sort of inclusion into something that's like further cooked, and then what's left over from that can then be cooked into a nourishing broth. And back in the olden times, you would use everything, every part of the animal, every part of the plant. And as our food system has gotten more commercialized, these waste streams have emerged. So even if you look at kind of outside the home, at an example like in the dairy industry, cheese, the production of cheese produces a side stream called whey. And in the 60s, the 70s, dairy producers, at least dairy producers in the US, cheese producers had a problem with what to do with all this whey that was being produced from their cheese production. And there's a lot of literature on this that folks can look into. What emerged, of course, is technology to convert that whey, which is quite high in protein, into whey protein, which is one of the commercially successful protein powders, that are available in the market, that are found in all kinds of products. So this whole idea of upcycling, it's kind of a newish term for a pretty old idea. And anyone who is doing their part to eat everything up at home, is, you could argue that they're doing the upcycling, but that's quite different than looking at kind of large scale food production and kind of connecting the dots between these different players in the value chain that are operating in more of a linear capacity, where we envision more of a circular economy, more like an ecosystem, less like a linear take, make, waste production line.
Okay, I think I understand, and it makes sense that. I mean, you were right. The example that you gave out from chicken to enchiladas and then broth, that has been happening for a very long time. Even I think in India, there have been a lot of different forms of upcycling, where we usually in rural India, they use leaves as plates, and then those plates are then
Yeah,
later used as compost, and then it goes from one type of product to another, and it's
yeah.
kind of an upcycling thing.
For sure. I mean, in India, there's a lot of cashews that are produced in India, right? Are you familiar with the cashew apple?
Yeah. Yes. They're
Yeah,
very famous.
very few people elsewhere in the world are, outside of, Brazil and India, are as familiar with that. That's another good example, and yeah, it's something that these types of solutions, not all of them need to be super high technology. Something like fruit, just preserving the shelf life, but dehydrating it so that it has a longer shelf life, and then finding, markets for it. This is one of these problems that we should be able to solve globally.
I think the role of technology is to enable people to do it on scale and do it more
Hmm.
efficiently than it would happen otherwise.
Yeah, well, and in some cases also there's technology, if you depending on how narrowly you define technology, like there's processing technology, right, machinery technology, but there's also technology. Like I would argue that certain enzymes could be considered technology, right? And there's enzymes that have been developed that can convert certain parts of like a fiber, for example, into its sugar component, which then unlocks new product opportunities. So there's this technology that can preserve what's already there and extend shelf life, and the like at scale, right? But there's also technology that can convert something that has latent value into something that has, commercial applications that without that technology, it may not have existed. And for people at home, I mean, you can use your oven to dehydrate something, right? So there's some of these technologies are not super sophisticated, whereas others have, layers of patents, that can be.
Makes sense. So if we talk about right now the current situation for upcycled food, and based on like my amateur research about and going on the website, so is Regrained is your flagship product that you're most success with and you're promoting as well. Can you tell me a little bit about basically for any kind of upcycling, there is as you mentioned, there's a waste stream coming in and then there's a high value product being produced from it, and during this process there might be some bottlenecks and some technical challenges and a lot of different things comes up. So I go to them one by one. So first I was curious about if we talk about Regrained only.
Yeah, sure.
And I understand that you're sourcing spent grains from different breweries and from multiple sources. How does that process ends up giving you a consistent product, basically consistent and highly nutritious powder that you mentioned? So are there any things you're taking care of so that the final product is consistent, even if the feedstock is not consistent, it's coming from different type of beers? And so how does that?
It's a really smart question. So a lot of it for us, if we think about the supply side and the demand side of what we do, this is on the supply side of the breweries we work with and their production processes. We've developed a protocol basically for sourcing that, to simplify it, I mean, we're looking at breweries that are commercially producing packaged beer for distribution. So they are producing the same beer in the same ways, and we can, achieve consistency because there's such a large volume of grain byproduct that's generated from even every batch. Now, at a smaller scale, some of these breweries that are, the US, for example, there's over 9,000 breweries, and many of these breweries are small. San Francisco has more breweries than neighborhoods, for example, and they may be brewing different beers every week. Those don't make the best inputs for us to produce a commercial wholesale ingredient that another company is relying on us to provide consistently. But that doesn't mean that smaller operation couldn't necessarily be using their grains at a smaller scale, internally. And actually, our original idea was to open a brewery that was also a food facility where we could make beer and bread, for example, in the same place, and have it be kind of more of a closed loop, local concept. That's not what we're doing commercially, because we're really focused on trying to see if we can accelerate the adoption of these types of solutions, at scale. And, I spoke to a little bit as to how we're accomplishing that by making sure that the supply, side matches what the demand side needs. But we'd love to see, and we were inspired by examples before us of using, beer grains in food production. And when I started making bread from my own home brewing, that was inspired by reading about breweries that were serving pretzels and pizzas and, burger buns, made using this just at a pub scale. And then when you dig more into the research, you can find evidence in Europe during the Middle Ages and, what's now Germany, breads that were made using brewers' grains. I mean, we've been making beer for a very, very long time as humanity, right? And there's evidence of bread making using the grains from beer production going back to Mesopotamia, right? I mean, so this is not a new idea. What's new is the implementation of it at a scale that is aligned with the way our food system is actually currently working industrially today, globally.
So I think what I got is that since our feedstock is also producing a consistent batch and they are doing it in a consistent way, they have a process to it. So these kind of fluctuations in the feedstock, it's manageable. And in the end, the final product, the way this value chain is you have designed for upcycling food, the final product ends up being consistent and basically have the same nutritious value as the first batch and the second batch and the third batch. Right. Okay. I think this makes me curious about what is the current operating scale at which you are able to do this? And again, my motivation behind asking is to understand what do you see in terms of future scaling, and where do you see
Yeah.
you are headed? So basically, where we are
Yeah.
at.
Yeah. I mean, so today we've, commercialized this product. We have commercial customers. We're selling to multinational food companies. So we're selling at the highest level of customer, that is possible for a commercial food ingredient. And yet we are barely a drop in the bucket of what's available, on the supply side. So there's 1 pound of grain on average generated for every 6 pack of beer that's produced. So in the US alone, that's about 20 billion pounds of brewer's grain that's available. So there's a long way to go if the goal is to upcycle all of that grain. Now, not all of this is ending up in landfill. For example, in the U.S., about 80% goes to animal feed destinations. In other parts of the world, that's different. But there's crazy potential for scale, and also it's kind of more, I guess, depth of scale on the supply opportunity. But then if you think of the solution side, there's kind of the breadth of scale that's possible with different technology processes. So our initial product is is a powder that's got a lot of protein and fiber in it. And we've developed some versions of it that are higher in protein or higher in fiber. But and I can't speak in detail about, some of what's in the pipeline for this, but we've got quite a bit of excitement around what else can be done with the brewer's grain input to create different outputs, not just powders. And so there's this, it's become an overused term, particularly in technology, this idea of a platform. But each of these supply opportunities, they really are a platform for ingredient development. And that gets us really excited too, because perhaps you could argue there's only so much fortifying powder, regrained, supergrain that can be incorporated into so many different types of products. But when you can create many different types of products from that input that are accomplishing that same, mission, that purpose of reducing food loss and food waste, putting food to its highest and best use, feeding people, it feels like it has functionally infinite potential.
Okay, I think so. What I was looking for in that question is is there a scale? Is there like in tons or just want to understand that number where we are in terms of like how much are we able to upcycle?
So thanks, Shabaz, for clarifying. I mentioned we're just making a drop in the bucket, right? So we're operating in millions of pounds, right? And there's tens of billions of pounds available in the U.S. alone, right? So it's come a long way from when I was brewing 5-gallon batches of beer, in a university setting. And we're proud of the scale that we've grown to, but we're quite humbled by how much is out there.
It's a good problem to have, I must say. So Dan, I think a very common question around any kind of like food product which is like made from an unconventional way, I would say, is the regulation and alignment with the policies and all. So can you tell me a little bit about, and I think this differentiates for each type of product you are able to produce. So maybe something
Yeah.
for powder, there might be a different type of regulation that you need to follow, and for coffee, they might be different. So can you tell me a little bit about that, like where we are, what kind of regulations you have? Are there any certifications that you have or things like that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this is I know you've got a global audience for your work, but I'll speak maybe to the Regrained product line and to the U.S. Specifically. I can speak to Europe and other parts of the world, but like this, the first product that we created, this powder that's made from the barley, it's minimally processed. Really, there's a history of human consumption, so there wasn't a lot of regulatory hurdles. We worked with the USDA, in partnership with the USDA in the development of our, the early stages of our company. And in the US, there's something called GRAS, generally regarded as safe, which covers products that you can show have a history of human consumption, before a certain date. And where things get into more regulatory, more of like a potential quagmire, type situation, is where there's truly novel, like new foods that are, being produced or special, or like extractions from food that are at concentrations that didn't exist before, that are from a regulatory standpoint considered novel, and those have regulatory hurdles. But the part of why we focused where we did initially was because the path to commercialization, including the stage gate of regulatory readiness, was quite clear, for this powder, derived from barley. It's trickier for some other things that we're looking at, but that's without going into too much technical detail. But that's hopefully insightful as to where that is. It really depends on what's being upcycled, and is it doing something at a larger scale that's been shown to be done previously that's safe and ready. And you got to show show food safety documentation. I mean, there's lots of documentation you need to provide to these commercial customers for them to be willing to take your products into their facilities. And so that it wasn't a small amount of work that went into that, but it just the path is clear, and that's another thing that we've become quite facile.
Okay. Are there any regulations that you're currently in process of taking up, or maybe any certification that you're currently in process of? They're not there, but they will be here soon, because I understand this process is very long. Even one certification sometimes end up taking 6 months, year, depending on, of course, which certification we are talking about in which country. But are there currently any in process for upcycled food?
Yeah, not. I don't think so in the way that you're asking the question. I think where there might be is some insight I can share, and more in the kind of development pipeline when we're looking at upcycling as an enabler for things like cultivated foods, for example, or lab grown as they're sometimes called. Those face more regulatory hurdles, for example. But we have a stage gate process for how we advance things, and yeah, there's probably not much more I can add to that at this time. But it's when you're thinking about things like cultivated foods, that's a representative example of where there are more regulatory hurdles, and that's certainly relevant for us. But we've got innovation processes that are
I understand. So
kind of aligned with those different timelines. Yeah.
Yeah. Is cultivated food also on the pipeline? I mean, maybe in future development, or is it like currently actively going on that you're working on? In very soon,
Well,
we might.
it's more that what we're working on become inputs to that. So you can use the principles of upcycling to develop, and we are doing this, to develop feedstocks and develop growth media, and things like that. And so it's kind of like this upcycling foods is is one of the tools available to empower the cultivated foods, as well as other aspects of the food system, including packaging, for example, right? So there's that's why I like to speak of upcycling not as a trend in itself, but as an enabler, as a technology that enables these other areas of innovation.
Makes sense. And now that you've given me a very good example of the growth media and the proteins to feed the cultured cells. I think because I was talking to another founder of Meatly. I'm not sure if you've heard of them. Meatly. They make pet food using cultured cells, specifically chicken. And during that research, I figured out that one of the biggest challenge of that industry is, sourcing the growth media and sourcing the catalyst to grow these cells and keeping that process sustainable. I like seeing from both ends. I see the value in upcycling that can contribute to that industry. Yeah. So it makes sense. Thanks for sharing that example, Dan.
Yeah, well put. Yeah.
Now, again, I won't take a lot of your time now. Just one last question. And this is coming from my personal curiosity about founders, whichever founder I talk to. You have a very interesting backstory for starting upcycling food. This is like every university student they try to, do something like this, like brew or start something in their garage. At a time, even one of my dream was also to start something from, we started computer repair shop with my friends, and we did it. We pulled it off for a while, and then we really dropped it off. Of course, it wasn't sustainable. But I'm sure a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of founders, they go through this feeling that, okay, what if this doesn't work? What if this fails? What if it doesn't scale as I'm planning to? And I'm sure, you being a founder, you must also have gone through, maybe might be going through right now as well, these kind of questions. So my question to you is how do you manage that stress in all of these, all of the different things being balancing all of this, and then there's this innate fear coming in, and maybe what if this doesn't work? What if, so how do you manage that stress?
Yeah, no, I love the question. Thanks, Shabaz. And I think, what you're characterizing there quite accurately often becomes a blocker for people to take action on their ideas, which is the hardest part, is taking that first step, because you're right. I mean, things don't scale the way that you expect them to. All plans. There's like a famous quote that I'll paraphrase. It's something to the effect of, plans are good until they start being implemented. Basically, because then everything changes. And so I think it's kind of you need to have a healthy perspective around controlling what you can control, and understanding, and embracing the idea that even though outcomes may be uncertain, taking action is generally better than inaction, and you can try to be an agent, in advancing what you're trying to do. And I think another big part of that is there's another famous quote that I'll paraphrase. I attribute it to John Wooden, who's a basketball coach, but it's talking about luck and how luck is where preparation meets opportunity, right? And so you can't really create your own luck, so to speak. There's obviously a lot that goes on that's beyond our control. But as a founder, if you can be prepared to recognize when you have an opportunity, to take that action, you maybe have that opportunity to take 2 steps forward, so that when you then take that next step back, you've still made forward progress, right? And it's definitely challenging. And I've been doing this for a long time, and it's an endurance sport. And the other thing that I often speak to other founders about is that there's not a single path to being an entrepreneur. You don't have to have an idea for success doesn't need to look like some global massive company. You can have a successful local business, or a successful side business. And I think everyone has the potential to be an entrepreneur, and we're just maybe less prepared to accept that it's kind of a choose your own adventure, and that there's a lot of different ways to do it. There's so much lore about the founders that drop out of college and create the next internet unicorn, and that's one path, but that's not the only one. To be an entrepreneur, really all you have to start doing is putting your ideas into action, and I think that's where a lot of people get caught up.
Yeah, I see. You have a very engineering approach to this. Which I really like, because I've seen this pattern in a lot of successful founders I've talked to, which have gone past Series A, Series B, Series D, and they shared similar fears with me when I posed this question, and they said that every day they feel like this. Maybe tomorrow there will be a new fire to extinguish, and tomorrow there will be a new problem to solve. But what I've seen the pattern is going very much so you mentioned that you always keep taking action, and your driving force behind those action is what keeps you going, and the reason you are doing all of this, that is what keep pushing people. So I really appreciate you giving me such detailed answer to that. And with that, then I think that was the end of our conversation. I really enjoyed talking to you. I got to learn a lot about upcycling, and basically how the thought process is here. So really, thank you for giving me such detailed answers.